everyone. Good evening. If I could have your attention, please. We can try the 1, 2, 3, eyes on me. Do you want to clap? Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Good evening. I know we still have people coming in, but we wanted to just give you a welcome, and then we're going to pray so that we can dismiss you so that you can get food. Sound good? So we're very excited to have you here tonight, and we're very excited to have Dr. Soong Chan Rah with us on this visit. So my name is Kenesha Warren. I am the director for the John Perkins Center here, and the Minister of Reconciliation Ministries as part of University Ministries. In the center, we see kind of our work as at the intersection of campus and community, and we focus on helping students live lives where people and community and reconciliation and justice meet. And so one of the cool things, though, that we get to do is connecting campus with the church and community organizations and leaders that we're connected with. And so taking times and opportunities like tonight to participate together in some critical reflection and dialogue as a larger community. Tonight, this event is brought to you in partnership with the University Ministries, the School of Theology, and Pivot Northwest. And so we're thankful for our partners in the work of bringing this event together. This morning in chapel, Dr. Rah spoke about how disruption, discomfort, dis-ease, and confusion might be good for our spiritual health. He directed that our lament should acknowledge the pain that goes on in our community, but that some of the failure of our churches is that they are not places where the fullness of pain can be expressed. He asked of us, do we know where the pain and suffering in our communities are? Who are and what are the dead bodies in our communities? This is especially felt with the heaviness and the tragedies of last week for our AAPI siblings and our Black siblings. And so we bring that with us tonight, holding in the midst, and we hope that these conversations will speak into our becoming communities of truth and shalom.
Annyeonghaseyo. Saludos and bienvenidos. Welcome. Let's stand and let's pray. Father, we come together here as your children, wanting to be people of truth in such ways that we are able to hear your truth. We thank you for opportunities like this, where you bring speakers like Professor Rah to help us hear new things, the truth in ways that unsettle us. Help us receive that. And as we have conversations around what you're doing and how you want us to understand our role as your ministers and children, how to repent, how to live well, how to love our neighbors. Bless this time. Bless this food. Bless our conversations, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. So go ahead and line up, and the program will start at 6:30. First one to the line can go ahead.
Good evening. Feel free to keep talking and eating. We're going to, my name is Martin Jimenez. I work with Pivot Northwest Research, and myself and Lisa will kind of give you all a little more context about this evening's discussion. First, I'd like to point out that we've got some events, specifically the School of Theology is doing some events soon. Next week is the Palmer lecture and other events associated with that. And then there's just lots of other things that that represent sort of the commitment and mission of the Seattle Pacific Seminary to really resource you all, our churches and our greater community, for the work of reconciliation, which is going to be one of the themes we'll talk about tonight. So if you'd like to know more specifically about the Reconciliation and Intercultural Studies degree, or the seminary. There's some folks at a table out in the hallway, and they'd be happy to chat with you. There's probably also some professors at your table that you could, throw food at and laugh with. So as the person who's probably the least well-known of this group who's going to be on stage tonight, I'd like to offer you all a little context as to the involvement of Pivot Northwest research. You would expect for the John Perkins Center, the School of Theology, and university ministries to be excited to throw an event like this, but how does Pivot intersect? For the last 5 to 6 years, I've been on a team with Reverend Dr. Jeff Cuse, listening and observing young adults in churches in the Pacific Northwest. One of the themes we heard is a desire to have discussions like we'll have here tonight. As Reverend Dr. Rah put it in his chapel address earlier today, discussions about where the dead bodies are. I'll let him elaborate that. Where the dead bodies are. The Unsettling Truth, which is the book that hopefully you grabbed on the way in. If not, grab one on the way out. The unsettling truth is that there is a trail of dead bodies, and sometimes they lead right up to the doors of our churches. Young adults are tired of pretending that this isn't the case. They really want to have these discussions. By education or by their own journey of discovery, many are not surprised by what's in this book. And they are actually really well prepared to facilitate discussions like this. So if you're not asking them into spaces where you can have this discussion at your church, I think you're really missing out. They want to decenter colonial power and colonial narratives. So we encourage you to leave tonight and to prepare your hearts to bravely engage your own congregation, your friends, your families, and especially your young people. There are, of course, several departments here, and we are all here to support you in this work. So beyond this evening, please reach out to us if you have questions about that. Together, we can transform the church, I think, and allow the church to become what the world desperately needs, which is healing and reconciliation. Now we'll have Lisa talk a little bit more about what the rest of the evening is going to look like.
If I haven't had the privilege of meeting you yet, I am Lisa Ishihara, and I get to serve here as a university chaplain at Seattle Pacific. And I'm so grateful that we get to be in this room together, our local church partners, our nonprofit partners, our connections across this area. I think having the opportunity to be able to gather together to ask hard questions, to be challenged with truth kind of at the core, the way I would say the Reverend Dr. Soong Chan Rah brings it, is good for our souls. And it's good for us to do it in the context of community. And I'm grateful for this space, for the John Perkins Center under the leadership of Kenesha Warren to partner with Pivot Northwest, to be able to invite spaces like this where we can gather together, share a great meal, but really dig into truth and wisdom together in the body of Christ. I'm going to give a little preview of where we're going tonight. So first, we'll have the Reverend Dr. Rah provide us with a short address about his book, Unsettling Truths. Then immediately following that, he'll be joined on stage by our panelists, the Reverend Dr. Masbo Verhage and Michael Wan, for a conversation. Then at your tables, you're going to have about 10 minutes or so to just have a conversation about what you heard. What stood out to you? Did something leave an impression on you? And do you have a question for the Q&A that we're going to jump into right after that? So we're going to have a great evening of learning together, diving in together, asking good questions together in community. And so one of my prayers is always, God, help us to offer ourselves to you, but also to offer ourselves to one another in this space. So first, I'd like to introduce our panelists so that you know who's going to be up on stage this evening. We're privileged to have the Reverend Dr. Liz Masbo Verhage, who is pastor, preacher, adjunct professor, and ministry coach who is passionate about building healthy leaders and systems to equip the church to do better. With 20-plus years of leadership in Chicago, Minneapolis, and Seattle, she has focused on developing multi-ethnic teams in local, global, anti-racist work, empowering women and women of color to heal and lead, and reimagining spiritual formation as soul care, a lifestyle of justice and compassion. She holds a PhD in theology and ethics from Garrett Evangelical and Northwestern. She and her husband, Peter, live in Edmonds, Washington, with their tween, teenager, and golden doodle, enjoying Pacific Northwest beaches, mountains, and Thai food together. Reverend Liz is a friend and colleague of the JPC, the John Perkins Center, who was on a panel with us in fall 2021 for the Perkins Fall Lecture Series with the Reverend Dominique Gilliard. So we welcome you back, Reverend Liz. Our next panelist is Michael Wan, who for the past 4 years has served as the Director of Youth Programming at Lake Berrien Presbyterian Church, creating numerous after-school and summer programs for middle and high school students in the Highline School District. Program focuses have ranged from community organizing tactics to critical theological formation to small business development. His current focus is the formation of a worker-owned cooperative with a small group of high school students and young adults. Michael also works at Likelihood Seattle as their editorial manager, where he gets to invest in his love for fashion and storytelling. He graduated with his MA in Christian Studies from SPU in 2019, so he's an alum, and was fortunate to spend much of his time studying under the mentorship of Brian Bantam. He and his partner Megan and their dog Azuki live in Highland Park next to the White Center community. Michael loves watching movies, playing video games, and spending time with loved ones. It is also my honor to introduce the Reverend Dr. Soong Chan Rah, who is currently serving as the Robert B. Munger Professor of Evangelism at Fuller Theological Seminary. He's the author of The Next Evangelicalism, Many Colors, Prophetic Lament. He co-authored Forgive Us, Return to Justice, and what brings us here tonight, Unsettling Truths. Dr. Rah is a robust educational formation, has an educational formation with a BA from Columbia University, an MDiv from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, a THM from Harvard University, a DMin from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and a THD from Duke University. You know, you got to do the whole list. Dr. Rah was the founding senior pastor of Cambridge Community Fellowship Church, a multi-ethnic church living out the values of racial reconciliation and social justice in the urban context of the Boston area. He has served on several boards such as World Vision, Sojourners, and the CCDA. He has extensive experience as a cross-cultural preacher and main stage speaker at numerous churches, college campuses, and conferences, including Urbana, CCDA National, the Justice Conference. And this is actually his return visit to SPU. And so we're grateful that he has come back to join us. So tonight, would you join me in welcoming the Reverend Dr. Soong Chan Rah?
Well, thank you. Just call me Soong Chan. I'm okay without the formality of that, but I really appreciate the honoring and the chance to be here with you tonight. And I'm thankful for the chance to share on this book. Mark and I, those of you know my co-author Mark and I, we spent, this was Mark's first book. This was my seventh or eighth book. And so my expectation of when we were going to get this book done, he and I had a very differing opinion. And I think he wanted to get this done 3 years earlier than we actually ended up releasing the book. We're thankful for the impact that it's had and the questions and the thinking that it has sparked. So I want to look at kind of three key things and themes from the book and talk about maybe three kind of areas that this book can spark. One is more general, as in kind of the larger framing around narratives and imagination. Second is more specific, the example of the doctrine of discovery. And then the third is, where do we go from here? So we're going to kind of look at those three different categories. Do you have my slides from? Okay, so let's start with the first slide to talk about the larger framework of narratives and imagination and how that's an important way of engaging a book like this, and also our topic around Native American issues, justice issues, etc. This might be familiar to many. This is the work of Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman, who many, many years ago wrote a book called The Social Construction of Reality. And it was their attempt to do, how do you understand social systems? How do they come into being, and how do we begin to work and change social systems? So Berger and Luckman talk about these three categories: externalization, institutionalization, and internalization. This is in chapter 2 of Unsettling Truths. And on each of these, we have to acknowledge the impact on our systems and structures and our social reality, and that it occurs on all three levels. The first level, again, not in any particular order, because you'll see that it's in a circle. The first level I'll talk about is the individual level, and that's the process of externalization. And that is when an individual comes into a system, a culture, a school, a church, a neighborhood, and that individual externalizes his or her value system, way of thinking, history, all that into the system. And so externalization is when the individual shapes and changes the system. But as we know, systems are not stagnant. Systems and structures take on a life of their own. And Berger and Luckman addressed this as institutionalization, where the systems take on a life of their own. They become institutionalized. I was a church planter, and as an individual, I contributed to the system of the church as a church planting pastor. But after several years, the church takes on a life of its own, separate from the individuals that helped to found that church. So after I left the church 10 years after the church started, the church had an identity separate and distinct from the founder of the church. And the church continues on after the founder leaves. And this happens, of course, with institutions like a seminary or a school or a denomination. These institutions take on a life of their own, separate from the individuals who founded that organization. So these two levels of reality, social reality and how social reality is formed. The individual, externalization, the social systemic, institutionalization, are the two ways that the church in the West have fought it out about how we're going to change the world, right? And in fact, this has been an ongoing conversation for the last 100 years. More than that, but particularly in the last 100 years in the United States, it is the divide between personal evangelism, change the individual, and social justice, change the system. And this, what David Moberg calls the great reversal, and the separation of changing the world through individual change and changing the world to social structural change. And sadly, for the last 100 years, we've been kind of battling it out, that certain groups in American Christianity focus on personal evangelism, and other groups focus on social change. And sadly, they have not been in the same page. They have been at the opposite ends of the spectrum. Now, I come from a community that has always been in between those spaces, that you naturally do both and. Of course, you preach the gospel on an individual level to your neighbors, and you share the gospel with your friends, but the gospel is not just individualistic. The gospel also has social structural impact. And so for me, I've always seen this as a both and. It's come from my education, it's come from the churches that I've served at, it's come from the communities that have shaped me and influenced me, but it's always a both and for me, the need to change the individual and change the systems and structures. What's actually I've been starting to think about over the last 10 years is that our analysis was incomplete. That's because the fight has been individual versus systemic structural, and we left a third piece out of our equation, which what Berger and Luckman calls the internalization process. And in internalization, the imagination, the narratives, the values, the ideas of that system, not only do they take on a life of their own, they began to shape those that are in the system, and people begin to internalize the narrative and imagination. So that third piece, I think, is what many of us have been missing in our conversations on justice, on race, on a lot of these topics. We've been talking about, well, I've seen in the areas of racial justice, well, how do you end racism? Well, change individuals. And if you get enough individuals that are non-racist, then you'll change the world. Michael Emerson and Christian Smith in their book call this the miracle motif, as in it doesn't happen. That's not the way the world changes, if that's all you're doing. And then you get to, well, then we got to change the systems and structures. And I would say that both are correct. You don't want individual racists in a non-racist society, and you don't want non-racists in a racist system. Just addressing one of those is not enough, and my argument is that that third level, the narrative imagination level, what we as a society, as a church, as God's people have internalized might be what we have been missing, the third leg of the stool that we've been missing. If we go to the next slide, I'll tell you how I kind of came to this understanding. I came to this understanding when I was thinking about the evil systems and structures in our society. And if we were to say, not hypothetically, but in a conversation, what is the most evil system and structure in U.S. history? Many of us would say, well, that's clearly the system of slavery. And so you had a system of slavery, looking at Berger and Luckman's analysis, that shows that these systems and structures were formed by evil individuals, the slave owners, the church that supported. So it was a both and in terms of the evil system of slavery. It was supported by evil, sinful people, but you also had an evil, sinful structure. So this sinful structure had to be confronted in a systemic way. And it was. It was confronted by a civil war. It was confronted by laws like the Emancipation Proclamation. It was confronted by social structural movements. It was confronted like Juneteenth. So you had all these systemic and individual confrontations to tear down the evil system of slavery. And we could argue that the system and structure of slavery was torn down in the 19th century. But the problem is that the system reconstituted itself very quickly. It rebuilt itself very quickly, and it was Jim Crow. And Jim Crow was almost as effective as the system of slavery. It created sharecropping, which is not slavery, but it's not that much better than slavery either. It created systems and structures, and in a way that African Americans, especially in the Deep South, did not have access to resources, did not have the right to vote, did not have the right to own property. So Jim Crow was almost as effective as slavery. And again, Jim Crow was formed by individuals and by systems and structures. So we had a systemic intervention to end Jim Crow. And we had individuals in that fight. We needed the LBJs and the Martin Luther King Jr.'s, and we needed the Malcolm X, and we needed these individuals to confront the systems of injustice, but we also could not have done it without the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Movement, systemic structural confrontation. Again, both and. But here's the part that confused me. We had an evil system of slavery, structural individual confrontation, it was torn down. Then rose up a system of Jim Crow. And we again had a confrontation on an individual and systemic level, and that was torn down. But those systems keep rebuilding themselves. And now we have the system and structure of the new Jim Crow. And you could argue that the new Jim Crow is not as bad as the old Jim Crow, but it's also not that much better than the old Jim Crow. So here's some minor examples on this. One would be the Civil Rights Movement wanted to bring the power of the vote to the African American community. What is the most populous African American community in terms of a district? I gave it away. What's the most populous African American community as a voting district in the United States? Washington, D.C., right? The District of Columbia has the largest percentage of African Americans in that voting district. It fluctuates anywhere from 80 to 85, some as high as 90%. It's probably more in the 80% range. What's their representation in the federal government, last time we checked? None. They have no senators. They have no people in the House of Representatives. They have no representation. And so we have the most populous African-American community without any sense of any possibility at this point of actually having a vote that 5 other states that are small or just as small as the District of Columbia have. Now, that's 10 senators from 5 small, mostly white, overwhelmingly white states with more power than the District of Columbia. So we keep repeating these patterns. Well, okay, that's the Washington, D.C., that's a unique situation. Well, what about the second most populous African-American voting district? It happens to be the state of Mississippi, anywhere from 40 to 45% African-American. They have 6 representatives to the federal government. How many are African-American? 1. 1 out of 6, representing about 3 out of 6. Why? Because you gerrymander, because you have a system of incarceration that incarcerates a large number of black men, and then you also deny the vote to those who are incarcerated. You have voter suppression. And so you have created a system where the black vote is lost in many parts of Mississippi. And so, yes, it's a little better than old Jim Crow, and yeah, it's a little better than slavery, but the more things change, the more things stay the same, and the systems and structures of oppression continue to rebuild themselves. And that's why I'm looking at that third leg of the stool. Because while we tear down the engines of oppression, we keep the fuel lying around. And so when the engine gets rebuilt, we've still got the fuel to fuel that engine. So the engine of slavery is torn down, but you left the fuel of white supremacy. So that when you rebuild that engine in the Jim Crow, the fuel of white supremacy can go in and fuel the engine of Jim Crow. Well, you got to tear down the engine of Jim Crow, but you kept the fuel of white supremacy. So when you build the new Jim Crow, you've got the fuel to fuel the new Jim Crow. Narratives. Imagination is the language of my mentor, Willie Jennings, the idea of an imagination or a narrative. I do want to, if we go to the next slide, I do want to distinguish between the term imagination, narrative, ideology, and worldview. Because oftentimes, and values and metaphors also are in there. But I would separate out imagination and narrative from worldview and ideology. The word worldview and ideology tends to be found in more conservative circles politically. Right? They'll say, you are from that ideology. You do not know how many emails I've gotten that said, you're from that ideology. And usually there's a nice little adjective in front of it. You're a Marxist ideology. You're from the Marxist worldview. And you kind of start lumping everything into these ideological silos or worldview silos. So you could be conservative theologically, which means now you've bought into the conservative worldview, which means now you must be conservative socially, politically, and in all the other areas as well. Or if you are more liberal theologically, then you must also buy into all the others as well. Or in the converse, if you are more liberal on social issues, then you are probably liberal on theological issues. If you're a Marxist on your economic worldview, then you must be a Marxist in your Christian worldview. I have no idea how that works, but apparently I am, based upon all the emails that I've received. So you're getting this kind of perspective of this kind of codification of ideology, conservative, and everything gets lumped there. Liberal, everything gets lumped there. Progressive, everything gets lumped there. And so you're building these silos that essentially fight one another within those silos. And you have to kind of pick a silo, and then that's when you get the culture wars. But if we switch to more the language of narratives and imagination, and that will, I think, hopefully change the way we look at our conversations. It's not to say that I am in this ideology and now I buy everything within that ideological context. It's to say that I've been shaped by narratives and imagination. And so it's not an all or nothing proposition, like I have to give up my faith in order to be accepted in conversations on race. It's to say there are narratival aspects that have shaped the way I think. And one of those narrative imaginations is the doctrine of discovery, which is our second point of the example, the specific way that a narrative and imagination shapes our worldview, our ideologies, but it also shapes our involvement in systems and structures. Obviously, the work that I would reference here would be Willie Jennings' work, The Christian Imagination. There's some really interesting work on imagination by Charles Taylor. Andrew Root does some good Christian retelling of Charles Taylor, which I love his work on that. But the idea of imagination/narrative is that the stories, the metaphors, the way we think about the world has become embedded through our practices and the way we lived in the world, that our reflexes are such, it comes out of those narratives and imagination. Think of it this way. My son and I love movies. We go to movies probably once or twice a week. And we watch movies we like old, slow cinema, it's called. It's like old Russian movies and Hungarian films. We have no idea what's going on, but those are the kind of movies we watch. But what's interesting about good acting in movies is that many of the actors use something called method acting. A year and a half in LA, I'm already an expert on movies. So method acting, as some of you know, is like, De Niro does it, Daniel Day-Lewis, Tilda Swinton, all the big name superstar actors do this, and Jared Leto on the side. You get so into these characters that, like apparently De Niro, when he filmed Raging Bull, won an Oscar for that, he actually fought 10 professional fights before he went on set, so that he would actually move like a real boxer. He got so into that character. Daniel Day-Lewis, when he was filming the movie My Left Foot, he refused to leave his wheelchair when he was on set. And he would actually not move. He would have people move him around. So that's the kind of acting where you're so into the character that you embody that character so deeply that when it comes time to improvise, when it comes time to act out of reflexively, your body language, all of that is naturally a part of the narrative and imagination you have physically embodied. The character you have so deeply embedded. That can be a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing. If you have repeatedly practiced white supremacy and continue to embody white supremacy and live that out on a day-to-day basis, then when it comes time reflexively to act in response, your reflexes will be of white supremacy. Because you have that character. Another book on this is Sam Wells's work on improvisation. The ability to improvise because you kept practicing a particular way of thinking and living in the world, and when it comes time to act reflexively, that's what comes out. And so I would argue that the narrative and imagination of white supremacy is so profoundly embedded in our culture, it is so deeply internalized that we have come to a point where our reflexes are of white supremacy. And how did this get so deeply embedded? That's when we talk about the doctrine of discovery as one of the earlier imagination threads that shaped Western society. I'll give you two examples. The first is the doctrine of discovery. Some of you know that the background for this is that there was a series of papal bulls in the 1400s, 15th century. The first set of these papal bulls were sent to Portugal, and it was sent to King Alfonso and to his uncle, who was Prince Henry, Henry known as the Navigator. And he's known as the Navigator because he had the ships that went to Africa and was one of the progenitors of the transatlantic slave trade. And so the story is told in actually Willie Jennings' book does one of the best jobs on this, describing that first moment where slaves, African bodies are taken into what will become the slave trade under the leadership of Henry the Navigator. The set of doctrine, the set of papal bulls that were issued, that first set was addressing specifically the work of Alfonso and Henry as they were seeking to expand the Catholic Empire of Portugal. And so the start of the transatlantic slave trade starts with this imagination and narrative that the Pope passes on to the King of Portugal, which is, you are the European body that is genuinely and truly and fully made in the image of God. And when you encounter a Saracen, a Muslim, or when you encounter an African, someone that looks different from you, that person is not made in the image of God, which gives you what? The imagination and narrative to look at a black body as disposable, as a commodity, and you can take that body into your possession and own that body as a slave. Where does that come from? It does not just come out of the air, it comes out of a dysfunctional imagination where the church weaves a theological and sociological imagination that says white bodies are superior to black bodies, and therefore white bodies can treat black bodies in this way. That's the first half of the doctrine of discovery. The second half, the second set of papal bulls, actually are written to the King of Spain. I believe it was in 1493. Why is that significant? What happened in 1492? Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Oh, yeah, we learned that in high school. In 1493, a second set of papal bulls are issued by a different pope to the king in Spain, particularly Ferdinand and Isabella, and to their servant, yes, Christopher Columbus. But the idea, the imagination is the same. The way of looking at the world is the same. European bodies are central. European bodies truly possess the image of God. European bodies are blessed. And therefore, when you go into the new world and you encounter these non-white bodies, you are a superior body, and therefore, those bodies are less important. It is, in fact, a blank slate. It is, in fact, an empty land. And so Columbus, this imagination, forms his worldview that says, I have discovered a new world. And as my friend Mark says, how do you discover a world that has 5 million people and 3,000 civilizations? How does that make any sense? If you believe that, by all means, leave your Apple iPods and your laptops, and I will come around and discover them. And they will be mine because I was the first human to lay eyes on those objects. And now I own those objects. And that was the language, that was the imagination, that was the narrative of white supremacy and primacy that allows Columbus to declare, I have discovered a new continent. I'm the first truly human made in the image of God to gaze upon this land. That begins to shape the imagination of the colonists. The colonial settlers are steeped in this imagination of white supremacy. And so when we talk about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, the language is of white supremacy. The reason why the colonists declared we want to have nothing more to do with King George is because King George is invoking the doctrine of discovery for England and not for us. So we're not allowed to go further and to explore these new lands and discover them for ourselves, and King George is keeping us from doing that. Hence, we need a declaration of independence that we also are going to claim the doctrine of discovery. And you begin to see these narratives, this imagination, become a part of the thinking, the way of thinking of the Western, particularly North American mind. The other thread on this is the myth of the Anglo-Saxon. And yes, the Anglo-Saxon people are a myth. Remember that Simpson episode? There's a scene where there's a person who's saying, tell us about your background. And he says, well, I come from the time when the Anglos met the Saxons. Oh, you mean when white wet bread? That was the line from The Simpsons. So there's this mythology that develops around the Anglo-Saxon people group. And there is a kind of an implicit assumption of superiority. This is the work of Kelly Brown Douglas in her work Stand Your Ground. And she quotes the Roman historian Tacitus in his book Germania. And the Roman historian goes to the so-called barbarian tribes of Northern Europe and Western Europe, but particularly Northern Europe, the Germanic tribes. And the German historian notes that they are a distinct, unmixed race with fierce blue eyes, red hair, huge frames. So he's describing physically genetic characteristics for these northern Germanic tribes. But then he goes into something a little bit different, and this is where it shifts. These people have a peculiar respect for individual rights. If we can go to the next slide, it's in the next slide after that. They have a peculiar respect for individual rights and an almost instinctive love for freedom. So Tacitus actually equates their physical genetic characteristics with their social democratic political capacity. And now you are creating an imagination that says genetically certain people have certain superior skills over and against other people. Not just their physical characteristics of light hair, light eyes, light hair color, and huge frames, but they have a peculiar capacity for democracy, lovers of liberty and democracy. And so you are conflating physical characteristics along with social, cultural, political capacity. And that imagination begins to shape the self-image of the Anglo-Saxon people group. This is the work of Hugh McDougall, a British historian. What else would you be if you were named Hugh McDougall? He's a British historian named Hugh McDougall, and he writes about the desire of the British people to have a mythology. Now, the Norse, hey, they got a cool mythology. Odin and Thor and Loki, that's a cool mythology. The Greeks and the Romans, they've got a cool mythology. The British have Lord of the Rings. That's not a bad mythology, but, it's not quite the same. This mythology, the longing for mythology, and Hugh McDougall points out that there is a mythology within the British people, and that's the myth of the Anglo-Saxon people group. And that when the Anglos met the Saxons, the Anglos of the British Isles met the Saxons of the northern Germanic tribe, they came together to form this super race. And they are pure in their physical characteristics, hence the description given by Tacitus. They are also pure in their desire for freedom and liberty and their capacity for democracy. So that purity must be preserved. And not only must be preserved in terms of the people, but also that purity also becomes a part of their religion. And in fact, a people began to identify as not only preserving the purity in their religion, but actually the purity of their people. And that becomes conflated with not only do we have the capacity to know the right religion using our intellect, but we also have the capacity to govern ourselves well and to become the democratic leaders of the free world. And that language gets conflated, and that's when you see those who come across the ocean seeing themselves as the promised people going into a promised land and claiming this blank slate. That's all narrative and imagination. That's all the exceptionalistic, triumphalistic narrative that becomes a part of the way we have viewed our world. So how then do we deal with this kind of fuel? Because that fuel will keep finding engines. I hope we can tear down the system of New Jim Crow. I hope it happens soon, because I've seen friends just completely damaged by the New Jim Crow system. So I hope we can be able to tear that down. But if we don't deal with the fuel that fueled all these systems before, that engine will rebuild itself again. That's the question of how do we change the narrative. So our third point is the practicality of it. If we go to the last slide, this comes from my work in systems thinking, which says that if you have momentum in one direction, you cannot change that momentum so simply. Think of it this way. You're on a hill, and there's a lot of hills here in Seattle. You're on the top of a hill, and there's a huge, empty, hollowed-out John Deere tractor-trailer tire. And it's rolling down the hill. You're about halfway down the hill, and at the bottom of the hill is your pet dog. And the thing keeps gaining momentum, and it's getting faster and faster. And so you're freaking out. I got to save the dog. So I'm going to do what a Western person does, which is, as a strong, heroic individual that has pulled himself up by the bootstraps, I'm going to stand in front of this tire and single-handedly stop this tire. And what happens? You're pancaked. Yeah, you get rolled over by the momentum of this narrative. So you say, okay, that didn't work. So what if I jumped into the tire and changed the system of that tire? And I will work within the system to change the system, but what inevitably happens there? You get stuck in the system, and you now get adding more weight and more momentum to the very system you thought you were going to change. So you try the individual heroic way of change. You try the systemic and structural way of change. Systems thinking says not only do you need to confront the narrative, you do it with counter narratives. You can't beat a narrative with more of the same narrative. The example that I've often used is the Red campaign. We got the Super Bowl coming up in 2 weeks. And do you remember many years ago when the Super Bowl, the commercials were a big deal? At the height of that, there was a commercial that launched a campaign, the Red campaign. It featured all the A-listers, right? It featured Denzel Washington. It featured Brangelina. What are their names? Brad Pitt and Angelina when they were together. Brangelina. Tom Hanks, of course, was there. Bono, of course, had to be there. So you had all these A-list Hollywood social justice advocates saying we need to be involved in the Red campaign. Huge boom. I think it was like a $10 million ad on Super Bowl Sunday. Their goal in the Red campaign, as is documented, well documented, is that they were wanting to confront the situation of the AIDS pandemic, specifically in sub-Saharan Africa. That's the area, and that was why they started the Red campaign. And in order for the Red campaign, I think it was Ad Weekly, and then Vince Miller did a follow-up study on this, showed that they spent like $100 million in advertising to try to promote the ad campaign over a 10-year period of time. And they raised $10 million. Now, you remember what the ad campaign was towards, right? The Red campaign. What was it? You were supposed to buy a red iPod from Apple. You were supposed to buy a red Target t-shirt. You were supposed to buy Levi's jeans with a little red tag, every single Levi's jeans. But every time you bought that product, you were participating in the consumer culture, you were going to help save Africa. But you can't beat an existing narrative with more of the same narrative. Now, I might say something controversial. There is a way to deal with the AIDS pandemic. How do I know this? I'm a basketball fan, and I love Magic Johnson. By the way, if you ever see this Showtime TV show, is it called Showtime? Yes, it's a great show. It's about the Lakers' Showtime years. Magic Johnson's house is right around the corner. They filmed those scenes right on the corner. Anyway, forget about it. So anyway, I'm a huge Magic Johnson basketball fan. I remember in seminary being at a Chili's for the 50-cent fajitas, and I'm there eating my fajitas with my friends and drinking water, and the waitress hated us, and a news item comes on, and you remember the news item, right? What was the news item? I have contracted the HIV virus, Magic Johnson, and I'm going to have to quit basketball. Now, those of you who are old enough to remember that moment, it's imprinted in my mind. What do you remember about that moment? What was your thought about Magic Johnson 25 years ago? He is dead. He's dead. 3 months, 6 months, maybe a year, but Magic is dead. Too bad. He was a great player. Now, 25 plus years later, anybody seen Magic? Yeah, he's looking a little chunky, if you ask me, actually. He's looking extraordinarily healthy. Why? Because there is a cocktail of drugs that does seem to work. And you can live a long, healthy life for 25 and wealthy life for 25 years. So is the problem that there isn't a way for us to begin to address the HIV/AIDS pandemic? Or is the problem the greed of the pharmaceutical companies that say we want to charge the same for this person in sub-Saharan Africa that we're charging Magic Johnson's $1 million insurance company? So is the problem we got to raise another $10 million for medical research? That wouldn't be bad. But the problem is the narrative that says we're going to fix this with more consumerism. We're going to fix this with more materialism, because you can't beat an existing narrative that is dysfunctional with more of the same narrative. You need the counter narratives. And this is where I throw it back to this community and to our two panelists coming up. What are the counter narratives that demonstrate, embody, practice a different narrative and story that goes against these deeply embedded, embodied practice narratives? These narratives are in our system. They're internalized profoundly. You can't beat that system with more of the same. What are the counter narratives that we're going to lead? So I'm going to invite our panelists up to have some conversation on this.
I was saying it's a joy to be with you all tonight, and I feel like Soong Chan hit all the easy top issues. We've answered them all tonight. There's two things that I was thinking about. They asked us to just share a bit, each of us, and then we're going to dialogue back and forth. There's a couple areas that I was struck by in chapter 2 of your book, and as you were talking tonight. And the first is obviously, as a white female leader in multi-ethnic and in white spaces, I'm just always struck with the formational discipleship work that relates to all of this, right? So I'm indebted as a pastor, a professor, as just a human to communities of color who I think help me see these narratives. Because I think for most white folk, we don't even know we're operating in these stories, right? I think what we're taught, and part of the privilege and the blinders of whiteness, is that we conflate it, right, in the church so much. We conflate good leadership or faithful ministry or a strong pastor. We have these thoughts and judgments and values, but they're based on an internalized narrative that for most of us we never know is operational. and it's hardly ever challenged, right? And so it's not, and I love how you're pointing out this third piece, right? So it's individuals. As a white person myself, I'm so grateful for professors like Dr. Rah, for friendships, for men and women of color who were honest with me, but also who lived a witness in a different way, because then you can start to see the narrative more clearly if you want to have the sight. Do you know what I'm saying? If you want to see. And then I think the other piece is knowing then, well, what is the work as white leaders or as white folk in multi-ethnic spaces with our families, in spaces maybe where I do a lot of consulting with churches who are maybe mostly white or in mostly white communities. And often the question is, well, we can't do anything. It's not a problem here. We'll bring in a specialist like Dr. Rod, make them tell us what to do, right? As white folks, though, in existing in those narratives, I'm very interested in what is that story? What are the limitations? What are the places where we're functioning in a mediated sense of reality and we don't even know it's operational? And how much more profoundly important is it for us to see it, to have language for it, which I think is part of what your work is so helpful with, to be able to diagnose the places of being captive to it, to see the ways to disrupt it, and then to employ everything from confession, lament, systemic engagement, justice work, but also, I love, to me, the fuel, this third area, it feels like that constructive piece. What's the challenge and the hope for white folk when we see? What are we invited to that's particular to our work? Dr. Brenda's work talks about there's particular work for white folk and people of color in reconciliation. It's different. So in this kind of work, there's particular sight with these narratives that challenge us, but also I really think invite us into more faithful, more honest, more probably long-term sustainable work. So I want to name that. And the second thing I want to name briefly, there's somebody that I'm really indebted to around this work, specifically with the Doctrine of Discovery, and it's someone in my denomination. Her name is Elder Lenore 3 Stars. And she's from the Lakota tribe. I met her years ago, actually at a conference you were helping host. And we were all strategizing about how to do work in our churches and in the community and community development work. And everybody was thinking, like, what are the best ways to get at, race and justice? And we got to her in this small group. And I'll never forget, we were going around, what are we going to do, what are we going to do? And we weren't really sure, right? Like, what's the best, most effective way? Because we still thought we were going to, fix it all. We were in that space. So we got to Elder Lenore, and she just quietly said, what are you going to do? And she says, I will endure. And our whole group got quiet, and I was like, that sounds really profound, but I don't know what you're talking about, right? And she kind of slowly explained she grew up, literally, her mother carried her on her back, running away from an attack on the reservation. And her mother didn't make it, and her grandmother, and she went through a story of her people and her places and her history and literally surviving genocide and attempts on her life in this land, in these spaces, out of a narrative that she was subject to, right? And so her witness, her testimony, it shifted our whole group, but also learning and sitting under a Native Indigenous woman who embodied that truth. How is Elder Lenore doing justice in our world? She's enduring. She's not just surviving, she's thriving. And, she leads and she does strategic work and all of it. But the witness to me there was also kind of a smack. It was a counter to the narrative that I didn't even know had been translated down through whiteness, through effectiveness, through individualism, right? Her narrative was so different. It was communal, it was historic, it was slow, and it was dependent on my own body, my own story. God at work in my people already will endure. So I'm just really interested in how we depend on, especially women of color, Native Indigenous women, who show and live and do so much work just in their thriving and in their enduring, that we get to follow.
Thanks, Pastor Liz. My first question, as I was sitting listening to Reverend Dr. Rah's introduction, was, "Can I have one of your doctorate degrees?" of the many doctorates and demons that were listed. Yeah, no, there's so much to say. I think I'll keep it as short as possible. I think the thing that's sticking out to me the most is what I hear you saying is, the logic of the doctrine of discovery, that's something that's re-articulated through generations. And I was sitting and I think about, my local congregation, who I'm a part of, who I work with, many of them who are sitting right over there. I love you all. But I know there are many local congregations here, like how this logic still plays itself out in even the most well-meaning of churches. And even the churches who feel like they are so on top of it when it comes to community engagement and justice and equity. And the first place that my mind goes is, I feel like I've spent some time reflecting on this idea of like, what does it mean to be innovative and edgy? And I can't help but feel like there's a certain through line there, even with thinking about the doctrine of discovery, right? There's this idea like, look at this new shiny thing that we just happened upon. And I feel like for maybe many of our congregations as well, as we have such good intentions to engage with community, to create counter narratives, that we do maybe a similar thing of, look at this brand new idea I had. I'm going to start this thing. I'm going to start this new nonprofit. And it's like, if you actually maybe took a year to survey your community and see the good things that are already happening, that you would realize that you didn't innovate anything, that you just created an extra thing that's taking away funding or other resources from something that has some historic grounds there. So I think that's what stands out to me is how does this logic of discovery, and I would add innovation, this like shiny thing, how does that kind of invade even the most well-meaning of our congregations?
Just to affirm and then go back to more of the conversation on this, again, that's where it goes to the imagination, right? I mean, it creates a way of thinking. It's not just, because in and of itself, if you build new systems and structures, that's not bad in and of itself. But if it comes from a diseased imagination, if it comes from a dysfunctional narrative, then the product of that can become dysfunctional because it works its way through the system. So, I mean, the counter narratives. The thing that I would encourage though is that I don't want folks to stop trying because of the possibility of that. To continue to try what is different. And if I were to change my career now, I would be a therapist for people of color working at predominantly white institutions who need therapy. I could be a millionaire in overnight because the number of calls and emails that I get from people of color working predominantly white institutions. Yeah, I'm doing it for free right now, so I need to get paid for this. But I keep hearing the same narrative over and over again. Like how many young African-American pastors called me and said, my pastor was finally going to let me preach on Sunday. It was in Black History Month, and I was going to be able to finally preach, and I was allowed to, set up the worship. And then it was like, oh, that's great. Yeah, call me about 2 weeks before and let me know what's going on. 2 weeks before, I can't believe it. He pulled the plug, and we're not going to have that special worship service on Black History Month, and I won't be preaching at the church. So, those are kind of the narratives that I keep hearing of folks kind of living into that. And then there's this frustration. I call it the magic minority syndrome, and that's when minority faculty or people of color who are in these positions, not the leadership position, but in these, and you have to magically do things that nobody else can do. But as a person of color, you will magically conjure up more minorities simply by your presence. You will magically conjure up a new culture because you are that person who is the magic minority, and so that you end up buying into the narrative, whether you want to or not. And so oftentimes they'll say, well, what can you do to demonstrate the gospel in ways that are unexpected? And sometimes it's, maybe I don't need to preach that one sermon a year because people are going to forget that very quick. But what if I were to start a small group of just 10 folks who are interested in these kind of topics? And it became the coolest small group at our church. Everybody was vying to get into this small group because we had the most fun. We were the most diverse. It was the party group, all the good things. And what if that counter narrative became a part of the new culture that you're trying to form? So, I mean, like you say, we don't have to, get a $1 million grant from Lilly. Not that anybody does that, but you don't have to get a $1 million grant from Lilly to actually start something. Yeah, we can do it on a scale. We can be those who walk alongside Lenore and say, hey, what does that endurance look like? And there may be different ways that counter, and I think the church is creative enough to begin to kind of think through what the counter narratives can look like.
Yeah, I think about like if after this evening, like I feel like something that we are consistently challenged in our congregation at Lake Burien is to be good listeners of our community, to be good stewards of space on the block that we occupy. And yeah, like how does imagination change? I feel like imagination changes when you hear stories and when you enter into meaningful relationships with people. I think imagination, like there's a chance that your imagination can maybe be sustainably changed through like a really life-changing like talk that you listen to or a lecture or a sermon. But I think long-term it's like churches aren't good at listening. Like that's just the thing. And I think how do we challenge ourselves to become good listeners? And that feels so simple, but I feel like that's a really tough challenge. And can our imaginations be shaped, reshaped by voices that we don't typically allow to speak in our church? People who don't come to our church, people who aren't members, but people who live on the same block as us.
Well, and I'm wondering, I think part of what you always bring into even a critique of how we shouldn't fall into these old narratives is still that hope for we can do this differently, and even sort of that creativity or that trust in each other to try it differently. And I'm thinking of churches or schools or even like, the house church idea that kind of post-COVID, I think more and more people, the question of if people are going to come back every Sunday to church is still unanswered, right? Or does the average person now come once a month or, not come? I think some of those, it could be creative. It could also just be maybe more rooted in a different narrative. So I understand maybe the concerns or just the questions a lot of us have, like where are people, are they showing up, are we embodying our faith, right? But I'm wondering if you've seen spaces or maybe just even how either of you have seen, what does that new narrative look like and what does it taste like? And even in spaces where I know a lot of these folks come from, I find that often, even the times that we're like, ooh, limitation, or oh, that's not what I thought, or the way it used to work, it didn't. Sometimes, right, that disruption opens the space for the new narrative to get more oxygen and flourish. So I think it's challenging and really interesting. So I don't know if I'm thinking of, smaller spaces or creative spaces, or not that institutions are always the problem, but it just doesn't, it feels like a different season to me of where are people actually drawn to living real life, right? And the reason folks are leaving their jobs, they're leaving things they used to kind of do in a certain rhythm. And I feel like it's maybe partly the Spirit, moving and reminding people to go in a new direction. So I don't know, have you seen this work or what the new narratives could look like and feel like? Or what do you teach in your classes to people when you're do this a different way?
Well, so the reason I became a professor is so that I don't have to do this. I just write about it. But that's the rubber meets the road question, right? What does that actually look like? So I've tried to think of it in kind of two ways. One, I've been really kind of obsessed. This comes from my former dean, Linda Cannell, who used to talk about a community of scholars. What is the role of a community of scholars in the church? And there's a unique calling for the community of scholars. And academic institutions like SPU, Fuller, those are where the community of scholars gather. And so I feel like we're wasting that resource because you're literally spending millions and millions of dollars to gather scholars together. And then, we never talk to each other. So what does, it goes back to community. What does it mean to form a community that actually begins to, kind of encourage each other? So, I joke about this. I have often, if you're in town in LA, let me know, because I like to do KB nights for out-of-town guests. KB stands for Korean barbecue and Kentucky bourbon. Kentucky brown water. So... But it's an opportunity for just folks to kind of talk about, Dom was in town, and we had a great conversation with Dom. Jamar Tisby was in town. We had a great conversation with Jamar. And it's just an opportunity to, hear what folks are thinking about, because, again, we spend millions of dollars in buildings and offices to create a space where scholars can be in the same space, and yet we don't create a community of scholars. So that's one side of it. The other side of it, and I speak about it often, was the community that I found at Stateville Correctional Center. And in that, I am not in control. I am not the expert in the room. I am not the host. I'm in a prison facility. I have literally had all the things that give me power stripped away. My laptop, my phone, my ID, all that stuff has been taken out of my hands. And that kind of community is absolutely essential for me to say, okay, there are spaces that I walk into in a place like prison where I'm not the one in charge. I'm not the tenured faculty professor with all the right answers. I'm actually in a community. So I would say, where are the places where you can think creatively, holistically, and just kind of be the person that's kind of innovating, but also where are the places where you are just walking alongside those who are enduring? I think if we have both of those kind of spaces, that's where some of the work can be done.
I love that you mentioned when you were speaking how younger folks, whether that be, or I think someone mentioned it in the beginning, right? Like young adults, younger people, youth are really equipped to engage in these conversations already. And I think oftentimes they're the ones who are like, y'all are so slow. Like, you're way behind. Like, we're talking about this stuff in our high schools and in our middle schools. And I think as a youth worker, I can affirm that. Like, that is so true. That as we talk about, like, what's the new way that we can do church, that young people have all of these, like, bubbling ideas already. So I'm wondering, for you in your work, like, how you've seen young people interact with these ideas, that be like connections to your family or through work. Like what does that look like?
So I am so social media incompetent. So my Instagram feed is I write things on pieces of paper, I take pictures of it, and I post it. That's my Instagram feed, literally handwritten notes to myself that I put on Instagram. But I got on Instagram because my daughter was on Instagram. She's 22. She just recently graduated from Pepperdine. So she gets that culture in a way that I could never get. And as I started following on Instagram, and then her friends, I started following and they started following. And they are telling incredible stories and narratives through that medium. My son does more Twitter because he doesn't like photos, but he does more Twitter. And it's like interesting how they are able to weave these narratives and it becomes a part of the culture in a totally different way than I'm used to. Again, my incompetence, in that is that I don't think I'll ever be competent in that, honestly, because it's not in the water that I've drunk, it's not in the air that I breathe. But the younger generation has always done this, right? This is the generation that has never not had a phone in their hands, right? I mean, now 2-year-olds are playing with phones, and my kids got them when they were like 10, 11 years old, if I remember correctly. So this is part of their social reality. And so for us to kind of say, oh, this is how you use it, it doesn't make sense to me. So that's where I think, as you were saying, how does that conversation be led by those outside of that?
Well, and so this is like a connection with how I was naming, just I'm stunned with the leadership of like Eleanor or other people that, to me, it's like I see the narrative like shifting, right? Like I see it lived out in a different way in someone like her. And how would you say, or how do you think there's like intersection with the ways of recentering or, a new narrative around not just gender as like an ism, but what are the spaces and ways that especially women of color, but moving around, right, the inheritance that also came with gender and sort of the ways that either connects with whiteness or with some of these stories, I think, around the fuel. Like, it's a different fuel, right? When that intersects and when women and women of color lead. Like, how do you see that?
And this is a very much a formation issue. And, some of you know the story. Just being very personal, my mom passed away a little more than 2 years ago. And she died in the midst of COVID. She had been struggling with dementia. And I tell quite frequently about her spiritual warriordom. First of all, I can feel the loss of that over the last 2 years. I can literally feel that the spiritual protection that my mom was for me for many, many decades, it feels different. Those of you who lost parents, you might know what I'm talking about. But I've said often, like, how do I, as her son, begin to tell her story better? Right? Because the imagination of the world, she was a welfare queen, literally. We were taking food stamps from the government, we're living in subsidized housing. She was a single mom trying to raise 4 kids in inner city Baltimore. She had no choice. She was working 20 hours a day. But Ronald Reagan called her a welfare queen because she was getting subsidies from the government. That's the imagination and narrative that is in the world. And the view of especially immigrant moms as either lazy or they don't belong here. So how do I, as her son, begin to tell that story differently? And that's one of the things that's been most important on my heart. How do I begin to tell that story differently? And that's why around the time my mom died, not long after, was the Atlanta shooting. And you may remember the names of the Korean mothers and grandmothers who were read, and hearing in the media that these were sex workers, when they were 72-year-old, 65-year-old immigrant grandmothers who were picking up the towels and sweeping the floors and cleaning the bathrooms. That's the kind of work that my mom did. She worked at an inner city carryout and worked changing bedpans at a nursing home. And so the narratives that are out there now tend to elevate white American middle class, upper middle class exceptionalism. And so how do we begin to tell the other stories? How do we tell the stories of Lenore Three Stars? How do we tell the stories of my mom? And maybe that's where the shift begins to occur. The narratives that shaped us are probably more along the stories of immigrant grandmothers than it is, 29-year-old Mark Driscoll. And that's the shift. We've got to, one of the more, I'm off the record here. I would walk into some of these meetings when I was younger with, and I'll say it, Korean American male pastors who are telling me their vision for their church, and every other freaking word is John Piper and Tim Keller. Now, I'm not saying they're bad people. I'm just saying that every other word doesn't have to be John Piper and Tim Keller. And then I'm looking at them and saying, wait, I know your family's background and story. I know that your parents ran a dry cleaning store for 30, 40 years and they worked, 15, 20 hours a day. That's the story you need to tell. Don't tell me about, what some person in Minnesota wrote. I mean, that means nothing to me. It means nothing to you, honestly, except you sound smart by quoting some of these folks. But the story that shaped you more that is your grandmother who prayed for you. Are your parents who worked long hours at the carryout. And that's where the shifting of the narrative is. Whose stories do we value in the church? And whose stories are we beginning to center?
Kanisha, how are we on time? One more?
I'm wondering if you could speak to, like, at our table, there's conversations about organizations and people who are doing work. An example of that is like Real Rent Duwamish. So with this work around building counter narratives, I think there is also this call to learn about the land that we live on and I think about this article that was written, I think, in 2010. It's called "Decolonization is Not a Metaphor," and that decolonization is not about decolonizing our education or our theology. It's strictly about the repatriation of indigenous land. And I wonder how you see those two, that work kind of coinciding with this counter narrative work that you're speaking about as well.
Oh, we just talked briefly about, if you don't know this organization, Real Rent Duwamish is a way to go online and calculate if you were to actually help repair and pay toward the land that we are physically inhabiting throughout the Seattle area. Churches can do this, schools can do it, homeowners can do this, and it's a small way to actually pay into the Duwamish Tribal Services actual money, saying we recognize and acknowledge that we are occupying land, you are still here, right? It's a way to acknowledge Native and Indigenous people are not gone, it's just they've been moved. So that's just one kind of specific way to pay toward acknowledging and seeing, and then you can have great conversations, right? As a family, as a church, as a school. Why are we paying rent? Why are we actually putting our money where our mouth is toward Native people still here? Why should we give toward something because of land that we got the privilege to live on? So that's Real Rent Duwamish. If you Google it, look them up.
When I was co-writing with Mark, and Mark still remains one of my closest friends, I would ask questions like this. It's like, okay, you know, we're writing this book together, and you know, the Asian guilt and shame in me keeps rising up every word that I write, because I said he wrote the melody and I was the doo-wop guy in the background, and so as I'm kind of working through the writing of this text, I'm like, you know, convicted about these very things. And then we would talk offline about some of the material that didn't get in the book about, you know, what does that look like for communities to actually respond. And he would talk about, you know, going to Standing Rock. And all of these statements were made about the doctrine of discovery at Standing Rock by kind of denominational officials and, you know, kind of key Christian leaders disavowing the doctrine of discovery. And then Mark would, you know, say, when I talked to them, though, it was a photo op. Because they would say the right thing, saying, all right, we, as a denomination XYZ, we disavow the doctrine of discovery. And then you would go up and say, okay, now what does that mean in real dollars of how that's going to actually change the Native community? So to me, it's like, okay, I don't know what that looks like. I really don't. But if we are exploiting, and you know, some of my Native friends are now like questioning some of the protocol of, like, you know, people use this now, the kind of the land acknowledgement ceremony. I'm not saying don't do it, but many are saying you're kind of throwing it out there as if it's some kind of like ritual that cleanses you because you've said those words, right? And what might be more than, you know, simply saying this land is such and such community and we acknowledge that, is actually to follow up with, like, okay, what does that mean? Where are the communities that once were the stewards of this land and are no more? So I think that's the big shift of, like, we're in the early stages in some sense of people actually finding out about the doctrine of discovery, finding out about these narratives. Now, what do those counter narratives actually look like in the church? We have had a slew of denominations disavow the doctrine of discovery. I think the Lutherans did it, the Episcopalians have done it, the Covenant did this a few years ago. So this is happening, but then now we've got to talk about, okay, once we've made these pronouncements, what follows up? What follows through? I know in our denomination, the Covenant, folks, Covenants, there was talk about, and I can't believe I'm throwing my denomination under the bus here, but there was talk about, there was at one point, there was gold that was taken from native tribes in Alaska. Is that, yeah, right? Yeah, and it was like, that helped to build the denomination to where it is right now. Like all the buildings in Chicago that the Covenant owns, the seminary, the university, was all from stolen natural resources from the Native Alaskan community. So, all right, if we disavow it, then we got there's got to be some teeth to that. And that's like, okay, now let's actually talk about what that looks like, to go down that path, to say, okay, just the, what's the word? Just the interest alone would be a lot more than we can afford right now. But let's have those conversations.
Let's say thank you to our panelists.
Yeah. I'm Taylor Greer, and I'm the director of the Ministry of Racial Justice and Reconciliation at Bethany Community Church. I graduated from SPU in 2009 and from SPS in 2017, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to move us into the next part of our evening. So we've been able to hear, to process, to react, and now we can turn to each other at our tables to be able to process together. And the intention of this is to be able to generate questions that you'll be able to then ask the folks who we've just been able to be part of their conversation as witnesses to, but now we'll be able to enter into that with them. So you're going to have 5 minutes, a generous 5 minutes though, at your table. So please pay attention to how many people there are at your table so that there can be an equitable space of sharing and receiving. So that you can process, what did you hear, what do you wonder, and then I'll call you back for then being able to ask questions of the folks on the stage. So go ahead and turn to each other. Maybe even take 30 seconds to just maybe write down some notes for yourself to get some thoughts together and then get started in conversation. One of my favorite sounds is a room full of people talking to each other, and one of my least favorite things to have to do is to interrupt that sound, but I'm going to interrupt your conversations, and I'm going to invite Soong Chan and Pastor Liz and Michael back up to the front as well. We're going to begin with questions. So this can be something that you're wondering or something that you heard them say you'd like to hear more about. One thing that I will say, 2 things I'll say to begin. If you need to leave at 8, please do not feel unable to do that. We're going to go about 10 minutes over. So if you're able to stay longer, please do. But please leave at 8 if that's something that you need to do. The second thing is please keep your question to a question. You might have a story or some narrative ahead, but please just say your question. All right. Let's begin. Oh, and we have a microphone that will be roving with Jeff, and he will come to you. So let's dig in. I'm also prepared with a question. Great. Here's my question. At our table, we were talking about the way that Scripture can bring a counter-narrative, but the question is, how can we approach Scripture without imposing our own narrative on it? How can we know that it's being the counter-narrative that it can be in our lives?
So I missed my contractual obligation because I have to talk about lament every time I speak. Is this on? To me, the lament discipline, which is very scriptural, is one of the ways to say, okay, what are we missing, particularly in the Western church? Because of our narratives of exceptionalism, triumphalism, we don't lament. And so some of it is just identifying what are the gaps in our spiritual formation, what are the gaps in our scripture. So I remember in seminary hearing about this church in Philadelphia, I think it was. That's why they're going to lose in the Super Bowl. So the church in Philadelphia was, there was a church that was preaching on the book of Ephesians for 2 years. And I was like, come on. I would it's like every word is a sermon. I mean, 2 years of the book of, or was it Romans? It was some New Testament. Probably. And that's where okay, at that point, there might be some Old Testament books that has a clearly different style of teaching, like a lament, like the wisdom literature. And so even just identifying the passages of Scripture that we don't tend to honor, we don't tend to think about. That might be even just a very simple first step. Like the Lamentations book that is also available on Amazon.
I just want to quickly add that for maybe many of us, the very idea that there's more than one way to read Scripture is itself what to teach. And the idea that our ways of hearing or inheriting or being told or being the expert and what character we locate ourselves in Scripture in could be different. So I think that right there challenges the narrative, especially for kind of white majority have never thought about that before communities.
Thank you for all that you have shared up to this point. I'm especially grateful to you, Dr. Rah, for your insight. But my question is simple, and I hope, and that is, what are ways that we can really begin to grapple with what difference does it make? Because I think the Western world prides itself on gaining knowledge and information, getting new insight, but how do we get it into it to the point that it actually does something to shift things that are just quick, and they said just a question. So I'm a preacher.
Were you able to hear his question? I know the mic cut out. Okay.
Mic cut out. You need to use my outside voice?
No, we're good.
Okay. Boy, that's a great question. It does come to what we've been talking about, said earlier, about how do you measure success and what is the measure of success. And so much of that is shaped and formed by American society and the narratives and imaginations underneath that. And if we were to change those narratives and imagination, if we were to, again, I hate to kind of focus back on this, but in my mom's passing, a lot of these questions started coming up, right? Of like, what constitutes a good life? What constitutes a successful life? And, the church has clearly bought into the American exceptionalism, triumphalism narrative. And I don't know what it looks like to change that, because I bought into that narrative. That's why I have way too many degrees. I have way too many degrees. Why do I need 2 doctorates? What's wrong with me? And that's where, like, okay, we've bought into those narratives. I talk about, I can't leave evangelicalism, not because I don't want to, it's because my card is laminated and signed in blood. I just bought into this whole thing, and my background, I can't go anywhere else. And so, like, okay, if that's the reality, then how do I remain faithful in that? How do I, think of new ways to think about what success looks like?
Oh, this one's. I would just name one practical thing, I think, again, for especially folks that are white coming out of being shaped in faith communities that are white, is even being able to see the narratives that we've assumed as centered, normative, neutral, and then disrupting them. So I think there's intentional work. And I think really practically, if you haven't already done this, it's learning from folks who are not white. And I always start with women of color, but learning from communities who had to already learn whiteness, right? And so learning from those who have this already bi-language, bi-cultural, or multi-capacity, because I feel like I'm kind of catching up. I have to learn new exercises, I have to develop new muscles just to even kind of understand what's already happening in our churches and in our multi-ethnic world. So I think actually there's the encouraging word, but also the challenge for white folks is there's always a ton to not just learn, but to live differently. And then our invitation can be to even listen to new voices and center new places of systemic and individual power to say, will you let me listen to you? Because that, right, the habits you were talking about, what do we fall back on? You have to be around it and sit under it and get bothered by it to kind of learn new responses. And I think it's a lifetime, like discipleship, it's a lifetime reality to say, well, that's not the only narrative. In fact, this one's not as faithful. And so how could I just be around and sit under, and that might mean making room, making new job positions, putting new scholarships out, funding different things, making a whole new table, moving one table out of the room, changing what people it's the practical ways that you would ever say we need actual new leaders, power, voices, money, and moving out what was there to make room for that.
You're going to be like, he's just the youth worker. Shut up. Shut up about young people. I think there's some deep intergenerational work that needs to be done, regardless of the racial demographics of our churches, because I'm sure they're all very different here. All of our churches, in some way, shape, or form, have some like dynamics when it comes to age, and I think that's really important. Is this intergenerational, like building towards intergenerational collaboration and solidarity, and asking ourselves, like, how are the structures that we've set up for leadership to be developed in our churches actually in and of itself, like, barring young people out? You know, if we want young people to be ruling elders of the church, if we want them to be on session, we have to make them want to be. So we have to recreate it, because adults don't even want to be on session. Adults don't want to sit through those meetings. So I think that's where it starts to, like, no, we have to really think through a lot of these things. And again, I think young people have all of these things bubbling already. It's all there. And I think all it takes is the time and the willingness to sit and to engage in, like, thoughtful conversation and to figure out what that even looks like across generational boundaries. Because, like, most of the time it's awkward, and that takes time to kind of build up that level of trust. So.
My question has to do with what I was struck with was this idea of disrupting the pipeline, or whatever you call it, the fuel line, right? Could you give one or two, like, really concrete examples of what the fuel line is for churches? And how the churches go about disrupting the fuel line so that we don't go back to the kind of the defaults?
I'll give you a horrible negative example, which is, some of you know, right after, I think Code Switch on a program on NPR did a research project on this. It showed that pre-George Floyd, Americans, like, were here on the issue of race, like at a 25% interest, something like that. Post-George Floyd, the number shoots up to like 65%. I'm making up these numbers, but you understand the concept here. And then about 6 months to a year later, the number goes lower than it was pre-George Floyd. It was like at 15 or something like that. So it didn't do enough to disrupt the narrative, right? So the backlash came back, and now it's worse than it was prior to that. And those of you who remember that time period, that kind of spike and the downward part, that was fueled by some of the Marxist CRT, woke, all of that language that was floating around, right? So clearly that backlash created this kind of negativity and the like. So that would be a negative example of that. And some of the way that was fueled early on, again, there were white evangelical leaders who probably should not have said anything, but got on YouTube and got a lot of publicity for saying really stupid things. Like, where did you get the word white blessing? Are you kidding me? Where did that come from? But remember, that was part of the conversation, right? I mean, you had this incredible, insane moment that was obviously fueled by a sinful, broken, fallen world with the death of George Floyd. But there was more of this conversation that was happening. And then, again, you can't fight the narrative of white supremacy by centering the white voice, right? I mean, there were some really key evangelical leaders who ended up saying things that I think just kind of wiped out some of that momentum. And so the positive would have been, and without any fanfare, and maybe some did this, I don't know, this is what I said to a number of folks who kind of during that time period were asking, what do I do? I said, take the summer off from your mega church and then go to a small African-American church or a Spanish-spoken church, any kind of church that's not your dominant culture church, and just be at their feet for 3 months. And don't advertise it, don't blog it, don't Instagram it, whatever your platform is, but just change the narrative of, all of a sudden, this is important, so I got to say something about it. No, you don't have to say anything about it. You just go and learn. And that would be more of a disruption of the narrative than saying, oh, I'm the exceptional white pastor. I'm an evangelical leader, so let me say something stupid on national YouTube. Yeah. That felt like a fueling of that narrative rather than the confrontation of it.
I see a question over on this side. Oh, wait. Did you have a question there? No. Okay. Miss Red. Do we have one more question from the group?
Is this working? All right. So in some ways, I think one of the questions, and it was, Taylor, is yours as well, and maybe also this table's, is can the gospel narrative be fuel?
Yeah.
And how? In some ways, the narrative you gave, right, this is me now not asking a question, but talking about, is that sometimes the gospel can be bulls.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we, as evangelicals, as a professor of evangelism,
Yeah. Yeah.
is the gospel fuel? And if so, how?
Yeah. Well, my cynical answer is the way the word gospel has been used in evangelical circles, no, because it's a hyper-individualized, there's a particular way of understanding it that is so culturally and societally inflected, right? And as an evangelist professor, I spend my time lamenting and agonizing over this, of how much of our evangelistic methods are so steeped in Western culture, including the word gospel. And one of the exercises that I have my students do is I want you to define what that word means. And the answers are like all over the board. And a lot of it depends on am I Presbyterian Reformed, am I Baptist, am I Southern Baptist, am I Pentecostal? And so some of that is sharpening what that is. And our more recent president, Mark Labberton, didn't use the word gospel, he used the word evangel, which is the biblical equivalent, the Greek equivalent of that. And so that actually, if we could use that type of understanding of the evangel, that to me would be like, yes, that is the counter narrative. But sadly, like you're pointing out in the history, the narrative of white supremacy has been fueling the way we understand the gospel, right? So that, I've literally been told by white members of my denomination and those who had authority over me around my curriculum, crazy, but that what I was preaching was not the gospel. I said, well, whose version of the gospel are you talking about? Well, this is what our version of the gospel, and it was this hyper-individualistic 4 spiritual laws. It's like, no, I'm not saying that's not the gospel, but that's very culturally inflected. So that's where I would say, okay, the counter-narrative is the gospel. In fact, that's the whole gospel story. There is a broken narrative in our world, and Christ came to demonstrate and live the counter-narrative of the gospel. But that's where I would say, okay, but if we're going to use that language as the appropriate response, then we've got to have a more robust and maybe even a better way of understanding that. So the way I've explained it in my class is the difference between truth possessed and truth pursued. The gospel is truth pursued. It is not truth possessed. And truth possessed is a Western mentality. I own the truth, and therefore, in my ownership of the truth, my job to share the gospel is to have you agree to my principles of the gospel. I first learned this concept in college when I was taking a political theory class. And the political theory was talking about the differentiation between truth pursued and truth possessed. And that especially in 20th century political history, those who had a truth-possessed mentality were the Hitlers and the Stalins. They owned the truth, and their job was to get that truth, their good news gospel, out there. Compare that to those who had a truth-pursued mentality. That would be Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. They believe there is a truth, but our job is not to own that truth, but to pursue that truth. And that, by the way, is clearly biblical. Because when Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, no one comes to the Father but through me, I think it's pretty clear it means that I can't own the truth if Jesus is the truth. Any claim for me to own and possess the truth would be heresy. I can do what he said, which is to follow him, which is the pursuit of truth. And so that's where the gospel message of, do I own the truth or am I pursuing the truth? Is the gospel a set of propositions that I own and my job is to pass that on for you? And once you check the list of my propositions, now you're a Christian? Then no, that's not the narrative I want to be a part of. But is there a truth of who Jesus is and the pursuit of that truth? That feels different than the ownership of that truth.
That's good. Thank you. Yeah, let's thank our panelists. I don't know if you can hear me. Oh, there we are. Yes, we already clapped, but as Kanisha's coming up to close us, let's thank them again with intention.
Thank you, Soong Chan, Pastor Liz, Michael, and thank you, Taylor, for also jumping in. Thank you all for being here. I feel like I get privileged every once in a while to have good friends that could come up and make great conversation. As we close, I just want to provide this kind of blessing over you as we go. But really, it's been great to have you here this evening. So, hear these words. May we confront the truths of our systems and narratives, embodying a narrative imagination, knowing that a dysfunctional imagination also forms our worldview. May we acknowledge that you can't beat an existing narrative with more of the same narrative, and be reminded that we need the counter narratives. May we come to know our internalized narratives, to see more clearly, and to disrupt it when necessary. For sometimes the disruption opens the space for the narrative to get formed anew. Help us to be more than well-meaning in our communities, listening and hearing stories that we may not normally invite, and to shape and reshape our imagination. Help us to do the deep intergenerational work needed, and help us to see where the narratives is shifting and within whom the narrative is being embodied and told differently, like those of our immigrant grandmothers or indigenous aunties. Thank you and have a blessed evening.